Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Women in the Archives webinar. Before we get started, I'd just like to make the Acknowledgement of Country. In the spirit of reconciliation, New South Wales State Archives acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Now, starting our research and our talk about women in the archives, we start with the website. So our website is records.nsw.gov.au, and just a few things about using the website. Its pages are usually quite long, so you won't see the whole page on your screen at any one time. So scrolling down the page will usually reveal more information as you go down the page. On the home page here, you'll see links to some important things. So I've got my pointer showing you the research A to Z. If you click on that, you'll go to a list of research topics. So topics that you can research using the State Archives, and they're arranged alphabetically, so A to Z. You can also see here we've got a link to our online indexes. Again, they're arranged alphabetically A to Z, so that's where we've listed names of people that show up in the records under a range of different topics, and you'll see there of course our link to our webinars as well, so that's where you click to go to the webinar library. And the other thing you can do is follow the tags. So there's tags throughout the website on different subjects, and if you follow those you'll go to more information about that subject. So as we say on the box at the side there, just keep scrolling down on the home page to find links to popular research topics. So things like colonial secretary, immigration, convict records, probates and wills, those sorts of things. Now, when we go to the research A to Z, this is a screenshot of that page there. I've gone to lower down in the list this time, and you can see alphabetical listing there and our topic of interest down the bottom here, women in the records. So what we'll do is we'll just go to the next link to have a look at that. And we have a range of different subjects, all sort of linking into that general thing of women in the records. So the first policewoman in Australia, looking at a guide to do with women in the home, women in the workplace. The My Handy Kitchen video is there as well, which is very cute. So well worth a look if you'd like to look at that at some stage. So when I'm talking about the research A to Z, I'm talking about that list of research topics, and then I'll often give the heading of that particular guide, and then you'll know that that's where you need to go to look. So some key dates for researching women in the archives, just to be aware of. 1788, of course, the first fleet arrived in New South Wales, and this is when the British sent their first load of convicts out to New South Wales, and that included females as well. In 1789, they established the first school in New South Wales, and then that was a small dame school, so a girls' school established by a convict, Isabella Rossin, and they taught reading, writing and arithmetic. In 1832, they began that large-scale assisted female immigration. So there had been some assisted immigration prior to 1832, but they really got into it from 1832. Most women came from working classes in the UK, and then some women also came from the middle classes, especially where they found it difficult to obtain a respectable job in the UK. By the 1840s, we saw Carroll and Chisholm starting to help immigrant women on their arrival and arranging transport for those women to country centres for work. By 1868, they were starting to professionally train nurses in New South Wales. In 1876, divorce was legislated in New South Wales. So prior to that, you could obtain a divorce or a legal separation, but the first legislation came into being in 1876, which was quite late for Australia. In 1879, the Married Women's Property Act recognised the rights of separate earnings for married women, so that was a very important thing. 1881, Sydney University began to admit women students. In 1883, they moved from a system in the childcare and protection world. So in the childcare world, they moved from that system of large-scale orphanages to more of a system of boarding out and putting children into a family or a home environment. And 1902 is when women got the vote in New South Wales in line with their right to vote at the federal elections. So it was quite a busy century in some ways, the 19th century for women. The 20th century is more about those industrial things that happened to make equal work for equal pay become a reality. So in 1919, the rate payable to females was set at 54% of the male wage. The assumption being that men had to support wives and families, single women who were working were single and didn't require that family rate. By 1950, the basic wage for females was set at 75% of the male rate. In 1958, equal pay for work of a like or similar nature performed by men and women was legislated in New South Wales. But then in 1959, the Industrial Commission formed the view that female work, for example, being a typist, couldn't be compared with male work. In 1969, the Commonwealth Arbitration Commission established the principle of equal pay for equal work with the exception of female work. In 1969, the Public Service Act removed the sections restricting employment of married women in the public service, so it's quite late really. In 1973, the principle of equal work was finally adopted by the New South Wales Industrial Commission, and 1979, unpaid maternity leave was awarded by the Arbitration Commission, and now of course we're lucky enough to have paid maternity leave for most sectors of society, which is a wonderful thing. Now, searching for the women in New South Wales State Archives Collection, there are, of course, some challenges. The biggest challenge, I think, is that we hold government archival records and only the records of the government or records that the government has collected in the process of its business. And these are an evidence of a past action by or on behalf of government. So it's the government sides of the story, I suppose. When you're researching people in the government archives, you need to think about what kind of conversation or what kind of dealing would that person have had with the government of the day. So did they work? Were they emigrating? Did they have children? Were they dying? Or had they passed away and they had an estate? Did they own land? Those sorts of things. And then there's also that notion of the relative invisibility of women in the records. So you might have to think laterally and think about sometimes the other people in their lives who may have had dealings with the government and how those records might reveal something about the circumstances that the women found themselves in. So when do women achieve a separate identity in government records? So arrival records are a biggie. Employment or licensing or some sort of business registration, when they have children, when there's health issues, when they might have to deal with the court system. And then, of course, when they pass away, there's also estate records, so deceased estates and probates, intestate records, those sorts of things. We do also have records relating to Aboriginal people, including, of course, Aboriginal women. Researching Aboriginal people through the records is fairly much the same principles as researching any other person in the New South Wales State Archives, except, of course, you go back to a certain point where you don't tend to find them in the government records. And that's because earlier on, they would have had little to do with the British society that was colonising the country at the time. So the Aboriginal Resources Guide is quite helpful to show some of those early records that document the conversation between Aboriginal people and the colonial government at the time. It lists records from the Aborigines Welfare Board, and it lists records from other government departments that also had a lot to do with Aboriginal people. So, for example, the Colonial Secretary's Department, the Police Department, Community Services, court records, those sorts of things. And just to be aware too that we hold the records of the Aborigines Welfare Board. Many of those that show names of individual people are closed to public access for 100 years. So once they're over 100 years old, you can access them. But when they're younger than 100 years, you need to get permission from Aboriginal Affairs New South Wales. Now, Aboriginal Affairs New South Wales have a family records service, and they have indexed the records of the Aborigines Welfare Board. So if you suspect that someone may have had dealings with the Aborigines Welfare Board at some time, it can be really helpful to contact Aboriginal Affairs Family Records Service to make inquiries about whether there are records that they're aware of that have survived relating to the person you're searching for. So they have a website. If you search Aboriginal Affairs Family Records Service, you'll come up with that page that's there on the right-hand side, and it does give you contact information and also an application form that you can fill in and send to them. Now, thinking of arrivals to New South Wales, of course, in the very early days, we're thinking about convicts. So about 80,000 convicts arrived in New South Wales over the time from 1788 to 1842. We think about 15% of those convicts were women, so looking at about 12,116 women. There were also lots of wives and families of convicts who were allowed to join their husbands and fathers in the colony, and this would happen if the convict had been quite well behaved, if they applied to the government for permission for it to happen. There was a process that people could follow to make this happen, and it did take a little bit of time. And you can actually find some of those applications in the Colonial Secretary's records. So if you look in the Research A to Z and then at the Convict Guide, you'll see more information about the kinds of records that we hold, both relating to convicts, but then more specifically for those applications for wives and families to join their convict people out in New South Wales. And then, of course, we've got unassisted and assisted passenger records. We hold records of free passengers coming out to New South Wales on ships between the 1820s up to 1922. We think that about 233,000 men, women and children arrived as assisted passengers between 1828 and 1896. And they're quite well documented. So in most cases that you'll find their name, their age, their occupation, their native place. Sometimes you'll find the names of their parents, so the mothers and fathers of the migrants coming out. And sometimes you'll also find details of the people that they knew in New South Wales, so friends or relatives in the colony. For unassisted passengers, it can be a lot more difficult to identify your person because the information that's provided was often so scanty. So you might just get Mr. and Mrs. Smith and children, or Mr. and Mrs. Smith and children and maid. You may not actually see on the list, it may not be recorded, the names of those children, and even Mrs. Smith may not be actually recorded. So it can be quite difficult to identify whether this is the Mrs. Smith you're tracing or not. So unassisted passenger records are quite tricky, and often you'll need other records to try and narrow down, if you can, that you've got that person coming out to New South Wales. Here we have a very early convict indent for the Marquis Cornwallis, which arrived in Sydney in 1796. It carried 70 female convicts and 163 male convicts. This one is digitised and is available on our website to view. And you can see here it's got fairly basic information. You get their names, sometimes their ages, where they were tried and when. and how long their sentence was. So it's pretty basic stuff. But with the details of where that person was tried, you can often then go and find possibly court papers from the time. It's easier, I think, in England than it is in Ireland, and also newspaper articles, given that now a lot of places are actually digitising newspapers, not just Trove in New South Wales, in Australia. Later on, when we're looking at convicts applying for wives and families to come out to New South Wales, you might find an application like this one from 1848. This is Patrick Spearin, who had come out on the ship called the Jane, and he was applying to bring his wife Ellen Day and their son John Spearin, who was 18 at the time, out to New South Wales. He was a tailor in Clarence Street, Sydney. He's also provided details of persons to whom the applicant's family are known, both back in Ireland, so 2 priests. And the application form certifies that Patrick is a well-conducted man and has the means of supporting his family. Here we see a passenger list from 1850. So this is 2 years after the application was submitted, and this is the ship the Anglia, which was an assisted passenger ship, and here we see Ellen and John Spearin. So John's now 20, Ellen's 36. She's a farm servant, he's a farm labourer. They're from Limerick, and they have come out to New South Wales to join Patrick as the application was successful, and they've made the journey. So you can see here as well that we also have the parents' names for Ellen. So James and Honora O'Day, both dead. And then here we've got a little note to say husband Patrick Spearin, per the ship the Jane, tried in Limerick and living in Clarence Street, Sydney. And so this is actually a list of the wives and families of convicts on board that ship. So you can see there's other families listed there as well, and in each case they've put down who the husband is and where he is and the ship that he's come out on. So it's quite a nice and tidy little record. Now we're going to turn our attention to women at work. So what records have we got to do with women at work in the New South Wales Government Archives? So there's a few different ways you can approach it, well, probably many different ways, but like everything, we have to cut down to fit the talk into the time that we have allocated. So we can think about the female factory for those very early convict women and some of those other poor, unfortunate women who may have come the way of the female factory. We can think about government employment, so people who were actually working and paid by the government. We can think about people who worked in occupations that had to be licensed by the government. So if you think about a publican's license or a hawker's license, those sorts of things. And also businesses where you might have had to register that business with the government as well. You can think about registered professions, so where you might have been a doctor or a lawyer or something, but the profession had to be registered. And then women in business. So the female factory, this really started in about 1804. Governor King had additions made above the Parramatta Jail to house a female factory for women who were awaiting assignment or had been returned as unsatisfactory from their employment. They were allocated 2 rooms for working and for sleeping. And we know that Reverend Samuel Marsden lobbied for years and years and years to improve the lot of these poor women and to get better accommodation for them. And finally, in 1818, they chose the site of the new female factory at Parramatta, and the women convicts moved in there in 1821. At the factory, women were employed, so they did have things they had to do while they stayed there. So they had to weave and spin, do needlework, make clothes, take in washing, and they had to pick oakum. And if you were undergoing hard labour as a secondary punishment, you might be employed in breaking stones to pave the streets of Parramatta. So when you next go to Parramatta and you're walking up the road, think about that. The female factory was also a workhouse, a labour bureau, a marriage bureau, and the regulator of morality, jail and hospital, all at the same time. And the idea was that it would relieve the financial burden on the administration of female convicts and their many children. Phew, holy dooly. Here we've just got a picture from the British Library, and this is just showing some women who were picking oakum. So oakum was a preparation of tarred fibre used in shipbuilding for the packing of joints in the wooden vessels and the deck planking of iron and steel ships. It was at one time recycled from old ropes and cordage, which were unravelled and taken apart into fibre. And this was a job commonly given to prisons and workhouses. So you can imagine it'd be very hard on your hands and probably quite a demoralising and horrible job to sit there and do that for 8 or 10 hours a day. Now, the Colonial Secretaries Index comes up a little bit in this talk, so I'll just mention the early index. So the early index to the Colonial Secretaries Papers covers the years 1788 to 1825. It's primarily a name index, so you can look up the name of an individual who was in the colony at that time, and a lot of them will have letters that were written by them or about them, and those letters will be listed with that person's name. And it's also a bit of a subject index as well. So here we've got Parramatta female factory. So you might have other headings as well, where you can look up the subject or the location or the government office and see what else there might be. So here, for example, Parramatta female factory, you can see we've got correspondence there from 1809 and on this page all the way down to 1822. And it's a range of different correspondence. So it's whatever the letters were that were located and indexed as part of this project. So in 1811, women sentenced to work were given sleeping accommodation in the local jail. Lovely. List of female convicts in 1815 disembarked from the Northampton to be employed at the factory. 1817, a factory and barracks required for the female factory. 1819, rations for the convicts to be 2/3 of the male rations, and children of female convicts get half of the male rations. Then we've got 1821, heavy postage charge made on prisoner Judith Myers for 9 letters received in 6 months from her husband at the Derwent, Tasmania. 1821, complaint of abuse by the superintendent, and so on and so forth. So you could read these letters and I think you'd get a really good feel for what things were like at the female factory at the time. If you had someone in there, you might not actually pick up their name, but it would still give you a bit of an idea of what the conditions were like and possibly what their life had been like. 1822, complaints of women at the factory. So life was not all rosy by any means. Here we have a letter from 1813, looking at conditions for the assignment of women convicts as servants. And one of the points from the top there, right up here, no female convict will in future be assigned to any settler or other person unless he's a married man and has his wife living with him. And such married person will be required to produce a certificate from the magistrate and the clergyman of the district for his moral and correct conduct. And if you wish to obtain a servant from the factory, you had to produce those certificates. So they were trying to protect the women that were assigned to these families for work in some sense. Thinking about women in government employment in other areas, looking at sort of the sources that you can find information, you might think again about the Colonial Secretaries Papers, and we'll have a look in a minute at some of that stuff. Firstly from 1788 to 1825, but we do have later correspondence as well. So particularly in the 19th century, where the Colonial Secretary was a central figure of government authority, it's a very good and fairly complete source of information for that time period. So we've got quite a good run of the letters throughout the 19th and early 20th century from the Colonial Secretary's papers. And because he had his finger in a lot of pies, land, convicts, various government agencies would correspond with the Colonial Secretary about things that were going on, people that were coming to work for them, or in the case of, say, mental hospitals, people going to mental hospitals. All sorts of topics can show up in the Colonial Secretary's correspondence. So particularly for the 19th century, it's one of our go-to areas of correspondence. We also have the returns of the colony from 1822 to 57. We'll have a look at one of those in a minute. And then we've got the later public service lists, which are, as their name suggests, a list of people who worked in the New South Wales Public Service, arranged by the government department that they worked for, telling you when they started, what their job title was, how much they earned when they started that particular job, and they'll also show you when they retired. We do have a general series of employee history cards for people who worked in the public service, and they cover a lot of the 20th century. So they're quite a good source too for if you didn't know which departments, or if people worked for quite a few different departments in the public service, these employee history cards are quite useful. And then for different government agencies, we do have staff records from a lot of agencies. Not all agencies, unfortunately, but a lot we do keep records from. So thinking Public Works or the Railways or Department of Education, for example, we do have staff records. And another place you can look is the Research A to Z in the Professions and Occupations records there. So here we have an example from the Blue Books, which were returns or lists that were sent back to the UK yearly. And here we're looking at the records of establishments. So they're looking at the civil service, so people who were employed by the government. And we can see we've got some women actually listed by name. Well, a lady anyway. So the matron of the lunatic asylum at Tarban Creek in 1839 was Susanna Digby. She worked there with the steward, who was Joseph Digby, her husband, I would say. She earns £100, he earned £200. We have 2 female keepers, not listed by name, and 1 nurse, also not listed by name. So it's worth noting that in a lot of these early returns, a lot of the higher positions or the higher status of job was people were listed by their names, but as you move lower in the hierarchy, people are often just listed as a group of numbers. And you see it in police force records as well, that the senior constable or the inspector of that station will be listed by name, and then under that there might be 20 constables at that particular district. This is an example of a record from the Corrective Services Department, and this is a record of officers who worked for the Corrective Services. So we're looking in the years 1869 to 1901. And this particular example, we're looking down here at Bridget O'Connell. She had previously worked at Gladesville Hospital for 21 years, and then she'd gone over to Corrective Services as a female warder, and she was later promoted to principal female warder at Maitland Jail in 1892. Then she went to Darlinghurst in 1896, and she retired in 1899. So she'd started in the public service in 1865, and she'd worked there for 35 years. And we also get a bit of a physical description of her. So we know she was 5'8", she had black hair, brown eyes, and a dark complexion. Our next example is an employee history card from the Public Service Board. So this is Amy Sims. She had worked for a few different departments over time. So we can see up the top there, she was born in 1884, first employed in 1928. She had started with the Chief Secretary and Instruction Department. Then they've changed it to health over time. And you can see here, looking at her list of positions. So she'd been a cook and a housemaid at various places, including Strickland Hospital, Fernley Hospital, Newington, Waterfall Hospital, Bidura Depot and the Child Welfare Department. Then she'd gone back to work at Newington as a cook and a laundress and a housemaid. and she was still there in 1943. So you can see up here there's a comment, medical report satisfactory, 43. We also have records of specific government employees. So here I'm thinking about occupations like nurses, teachers, railway employees. In each of those instances, if you go to our research A to Z, you'll see we do have a short guide on nurses. We do have a guide on researching school teachers, and we also have a guide on the railway employees. So what we'll do first is have a little think about the nurses, and just to make notes that in each of these instances we do have some indexes for these employees. So for nurses, for example, we've indexed our nurses registration board records from 1926 to 1954, those being what we have in the collection, so those being what we have indexed. And this year we've actually managed to upload the whole index is now on our website, so you can search the whole index there. So we'll go and take a look at some of those nurses now. So of course, going back to our early colonial secretaries index from 1788 to 1825, it's a wonderful, wonderful resource. So here, for example, we see Mary Jones, who was the government midwife at Parramatta. So there's letters to do with her salary in 1822 and 1824. So here we are. She's been certified that she was doing the duty as government midwife at Parramatta from October to December 1821, and she is applying for her salary for that quarter of the year. Later, we have the Nurses Registration Board registers. Now, these start in 1926. The Nurses Registration Board was introduced in 1923 or 24. The registers themselves don't start till 1926. They don't tell us a lot of information, but they at least name and place and date these nurses to their training. So you can see here it gives us the names of the nurses, it tells us which hospital they trained at, and it tells us their date of registration. We don't hold the certificates. We've got a few, which are usually those that were returned to the Nurses Registration Board, so there's a handful of those. But most of the certificates, of course, were issued to those nurses, and if they still survive, they would be in the hands of the family, you would assume, if they still survive. And here we've got a lovely picture of nurses at the Newtown Baby Clinic in about 1914, and some of those babies and children there waiting to be seen. I do like that picture. Now, with our teachers, we do have records going right back to the early days of the Colonial Secretary's correspondence. What I'm showing you here is a slightly later record. This is the teachers' rolls. These covered the years 1869 to 1908. We've got an index to the teachers' rolls on our website, and the teachers' rolls really tell us where and when a teacher was working and what their status was, so what their level of position. So Elsie Jean Dalziel down here, she was born in 1881. She started as a pupil teacher in Newtown Primary, and then it talks about all of her promotions. So she's gone up from a pupil teacher, she's a class 3 teacher, she's a class 2 teacher, she goes to Cogra, she gets a scholarship for an exam for admission to the training school, and then she goes on, and then finally she resigns in 1906. And we'll see Elsie a little bit later. Later on in time, so from 1908 onwards, we have what they call the teacher career cards. So these give you much the same sort of information. Again, it's a date of birth and it's a list of all the different schools that the teacher taught at, how much they earned, what years they were there, that kind of thing. So Mary Jane Tierney, she was at Kingsvale, and then she's moved to different schools, including Stockton Bingle, Marengo, Plattsburgh, Tyres Hill, Wallsend, Woonona, Portland Young, Canowindra, West Wyalong, So she's all over the country. Then she comes to Sydney for a short time, Arncliffe, Brighton, Les Sands, before she goes back to Young. Last day of service is 1941. So she's worked from 1907 to 1941. On the back of the card, they'll have comments about their service. So we've got here comments about their salary, life insurance, complaints, her charges against the headmaster. So she's been reprimanded to do with her insubordination and offensive attitude towards the headmaster. She was severely censured and censured and warned that any repetition of such conduct will lead to the question of recommending that your services be dispensed with. So that would have been fairly harsh, I would think. Then she's also in 1925 made charges against the headmaster. And the comment has come back that the charges are unwarranted and most reprehensible. And then should she give any further cause for complaint, summary dismissal will be recommended. And so on and so forth. Goodness me. So she was a bit of a firecracker, I think. We also have school files, and these cover the years 1876 to 1979, and they're the correspondence held by the Department of Education about a particular school. And so they're really good because lots of people would write to the department about getting a school in their local area. There might be letters about the buildings. There might be letters if they move the site of the school. There might be plans of where the students lived and what their relationship physical to the old school site and the new school site might be. There might be letters about the school teachers' residence, and there are a lot of letters in there about the teachers who taught at those schools. So this particular letter from Mary Jane Tierney in 1910 at Kingsvale is complaining about where she's boarding, and she's boarding with Mrs. King at Kingsvale. She's been sick because the tea was too strong, and she did not like to mention the bad food, she says. When Mr. King saw the letter, he was angry, said that if he could drink the tea, that I could, and I'd better find board elsewhere. When she returned to school on Wednesday, I took a packet of cocoa to drink for my lunch, and so on and so forth. So it gives you a bit of an insight into how it would have been to be a sort of a youngish teacher out in the country. You didn't have your own place. You had to board with someone else. Your food might not have been wonderful, and then they could chuck you out if there were issues, and you'd have to find somewhere else to live. But you'd still have to work and still have to do your job. So it wasn't always an easy life, I don't think. Thinking about railway workers, for example, so in the 19th century, every now and then, lists would be published in the Legislative Council's votes and proceedings and in the New South Wales Government Gazettes. Women were employed, of course, a lot of people employed by the railways were men, but women were also employed. So women worked as things like being a gatekeeper or in clerical positions and those sorts of things. So here on this page here, we've got several women who are working as gatekeepers. So here we've got Goulburn Station, we've got all the different people. We've got Mrs. Graham and Dinah Aliff working as a gatekeeper there. We've got Mrs. Guthrie as a gatekeeper at South Creek Station. And then we've got Mrs. Callahan, who's the gatekeeper at Penrith Station. And it lists their pay rates and all of those sorts of things. Then also for people who are still working for the railways after 1910, we have the railway history cards. Now, we've done a mini webinar on these a while ago on how to search them and the kinds of information they can tell you. They're listed and they're digitised in our catalogue. We're working through them. We're not quite finished yet, but we are getting our way through the alphabet. So we're sort of fairly down there now, but we're looking, I think, at late this year, early next year before everything's done and dusted. So all you have to do is go to our catalogue, and here I've just put in the search term Mercy Bell, and I've come up with her railway history card. And if we go to the next page, we can see what it looks like. So here we've got Mercy Bell. She was a gatekeeper at Quirindi. Before that, she was a platform attendant at Hadley and a gatekeeper at Gunnedah. It tells us the dates that she worked for the railways. So she started in 07 and finished in 1912, then re-employed in 1920, and she kept that position going for quite a long time. We have some remarks over here. So here she was injured on duty. Here they've noted that they cited her birth certificate, the date that she was born, where she was born, and it says that the birth certificate was returned to her. So we don't have these birth certificates in our collection. And the thing about that was, of course, you'd cite it, I guess, and then return it back to the person, much like you would today. You might have to go and show your birth certificate when you start a new job, but the office wouldn't necessarily keep it, although these days you might find that they copy it or scan it or something. Wasn't so easy to do back in the 1920s. Oh, my mouse. And here we just have a lovely picture of some women who were employed by the railway refreshment rooms at Coffs Harbour in this instance. So other places that you might see women in the railways might be as machinists and bobbin winders and clerks and cleaners, refreshment room ladies, gatekeepers, those sorts of things. They look very happy. I think these Coffs Harbour ladies, it's a beautiful area to live in. I just wanted also to mention our Blaze exhibition. So this is an exhibition from a couple of years ago now, where they looked at women in the public service who were really those trailblazers, those leaders who came before and opened the way for women coming after. Blaze does travel around New South Wales and other states as people are interested. But you can also go onto our website and look at the e-catalogue, and in there you'll see profiles of different women and what they did and why they're considered to be so important. So this lady in orange here is Phyllis Shalito. Her dates of birth was 1895, passing away in 1980. And she was important because she was a pioneer of design education at TAFE New South Wales. And you can find out more about her in the e-catalogue on our website. So thinking about licensed occupations, so this is where we're talking about the publicans and the hawkers and the auctioneers and those sorts of people. You might early on think about the Colonial Secretary's correspondence, but we do also have a guide on our publicans records, so that's in our Research A to Zs, and we've got a publicans licenses index, which is 1830 to 1861. Now, we also have the local court records where people had to apply for and were granted licenses for various types of undertakings, so auctioneers, hawkers, stage licenses, stage carriages, and Sunday trading, for example. So we'll have a look at an example of that. And the way to find those is in our collection search catalogue. You would think about the area that you're searching for, and you'd look for the Court of Petty Sessions records for that area, whether it was Cogra or Parkes or Bathurst or Coffs Harbour, wherever it was. Bathurst Court of Petty Sessions, and then you can see a list of all the records that we've got from Bathurst Court of Petty Sessions, and then you can see if we've got any of those registers that would record when those licenses were issued to people who applied for them. And we also have a register of licensed private hospitals, so I'll show you that in a second. So very early on here, we've got the Bench of Magistrates Index, 1788 to 1825. We see here we've got Mary Ford. So she first shows up in 1798 as being one of all the women servants in the colony, and the employer that she worked for. So she was in the service at that time of Captain George Johnston. In 1799, she's found at large in Sydney after she was sent to Parramatta, so she was having a bit of a hard time at that stage, and then she pops back up again in 1811 on a licence granted to retail beer. So she's come up with an occupation and she's working in that area. Here we have an an example of Mary Driver. So this is in the Colonial Secretary's correspondence. So we first see Mary in 1818 as the wife of James Driver, who was a convict. He's arrived in 1816 and she applies for a spirit license in 1818. She does that in 1819. In 1820, she's a publican in Kent Street, Sydney. And in 1822, she's carrying on a retail shop. She's applying to get a mitigation for her husband, so of his sentence, so some sort of indulgence, whether it's to get a ticket of leave or to have that sentence reduced or something. She receives an assigned convict in 1823. Possibly her husband was assigned to her, but possibly another convict. In 1825, she's asked to ship articles to Port Macquarie, but that wasn't granted. In 1825, she's petitioned to get her husband, James, to return to Sydney. And then in 1825, again, she's petitioned for the mitigation of her husband's sentence. If we go to the next page here, and we could look at all of that correspondence, all we'd have to do is to search for this particular microfilm reel in our reading room, and all of this correspondence as well is on the Ancestry website. So when you go into Ancestry, you can search for the Colonial Secretary's correspondence, and you can search for Mary Driver within there, and you can find her correspondence there. So I know Ancestry is a subscriber website. Many public libraries provide free access to their members and on the library site. And then we also provide free access to Ancestry in our reading room as well. Here we have that later index to publicans' licenses. This index covers 1830 to the 1860s. Here we've got Hannah Walker, and she was the licensee of the Red Cow at Parramatta, and you can see there that license continued pretty much throughout the 1830s. And here we have the butts of publicans licenses for Hannah Walker from the Red Cow at Parramatta, and we can see there's the date, 15th day of June 1830. She had to pay £25 and she receives that license there. So this is the butt. So if you think of like a checkbook where you write details on the bit that you keep, and then there's the check that you write details on and give that to the bank, that's this similar concept here. So Hannah would have kept the certificate itself, and the butt would be the government's record that that certificate was issued. Here we have an example from Bathurst Court of Petty Sessions. This is a bit later again. This is 1867. And on this page, we have a couple of women. So we've got Bridget Connell, who's a widow at Bathurst. She's receiving a publican's license for a house in George Street at Bathurst. And it's a publican's license there. Her application was withdrawn. Up here, we've got another one. She's Kate Gahan, I think, and she's a widow at Bathurst, and she's applying for the transfer of the licence held by her late husband, Hugh, for the house known as the Clarendon in Durham Street at Bathurst, and this one was granted. And on this same page, we've got slaughtering licenses to men, an auctioneer's license as well. So all sorts of different licenses would show up in this particular volume, but we'd had to check what we had from Bathurst Court of Petty Sessions first, and then whether there are any licenses in the period that we're looking for someone who might have been a publican or a hawker or whatever, and then you can go through the volumes to see if you can find that person. These are not digitised, so these would have to be inspected in our reading room at Kingswood. And this is a different kind of licensing. This is where the Board of Health licensed private hospitals, and they kept these registers between 1910 to 1928. There was a Private Hospitals Act in 1908, which said that private hospitals had to be licensed. And while we have no records of patients at these private hospitals, so I'm very sorry if you're seeking record of a birth in a lying-in hospital or something, we don't have those records. We would possibly, if it was at that time period, have a record of the hospital being licensed. So this one here is the Grenfell Hospital. It's in Leichhardt. It's a medical, surgical and lying-in hospital. The name of the licensees are given here, so it's several different people over time, as well as the names of the residents and the name of the resident assistant. It tells us the dates that people were licensed and whether it was approved or not, and it also tells us the total number of beds that were allowed at this hospital, so a total of 16 beds there. We have registered professions, so the doctors, pharmacists and lawyers, for example. You'll see guides to those records in our Research A to Z. And then we've also got our photographs of doctors on our website. We have the indexes to chemists, druggists and pharmacists. And we do have an index to King's and Queen's Council appointment correspondence, 1892 to 1950. The doctor's photos are a wonderful source. So Elsie Jean Dalyell, who had started as a teacher, and we saw her teacher's career card, she ended up going to Sydney University and she transferred into medicine. And she graduated as a doctor and then she went overseas before returning to New South Wales to work for the Department of Health as a microbiologist. And we've got these photographs from 1889 to 1927, and there's some beautiful graduation photographs of the women who graduated in those early days. We have a register of chemists and druggists, and that would record the men as well as the women, of course. It gives us the date that someone was registered as a chemist, where they lived, and some information about what their status had been prior to the Pharmacy Act of 1897. Here we have a photograph of Eva Lewins, who was a pharmacist, and again these were accumulated by the Board of Pharmacists. And like with the doctors where they kept a photograph and a signature, they did a similar thing for the pharmacists as well. So I guess that helped them to identify that particular people were actually qualified to do what they were supposed to be doing. And here we have a solicitor's oath of allegiance for Mary Beauville Biles. She graduated from Sydney University and she became a solicitor in 1924. And we have her signature up the top there, which is quite lovely. Thinking about women in business, we have in our Research A to Z, our Business and Company Records Guide. We have an index to register of firms, which you can search. So firms and companies are quite different. Register of firms, register of companies. The firms were often things like grocery shops and dressmakers and smaller businesses quite often. And we've got registers of firms from 1903 to 1922. And you can search these by the people who carried on a business or by a place of business, and you can also search them by the nature of the business. And we do have company branch records from the Registrar General, and to go along with those quite nicely, insolvency and bankruptcy records. So the Business and Company Records Index, you can search by the nature of a business. So we've searched drapery here. Another way you could search would be millinery, or you could search by the name of a person who you thought might have carried on a firm, or by the title of the firm as well. So quite a lot of haberdashery and drapery firms here, and you'll see these women picked up through that index there. This is the Register of Firms itself. This is the Mrs. Bobrowski, who ran a general store in Bathurst. Both spinsters, and the firm was registered in 1903 in April, and then it was cancelled in 1936, so they carried that on for some time. And the Insolvency Index. Again, you can search this index in a variety of ways. So you could search it by the name, you could search it by occupation, you could also search it by location if you wanted to. And that gives us a file number. here, and we do actually have insolvency files and bankruptcy files. These cover about 1842 up to 1888 for insolvency, 1887, and then 1888 to 1928 for bankruptcy. And the files themselves are the correspondence and the paperwork that was created to deal with that insolvency. So a lot of it's very administrative and credits and debits and all sort of money and numbers and things, but you do get correspondence in there where the person might have to explain how they landed in the situation that they landed in their unfortunate situation. Now, thinking in a different vein of research now, we add the husband and the children, and what happens next? So we can think about marriage and divorce records, desertion, we can think about childcare and protection records, we can think about mental health, and we can think about the court system too. So early on with convicts had to apply to get married. So here we've got details of a convict, James Little, a free person, James Little, applying to marry a convict, Abby Desmond, and details about where to find that record. Then this is the register of applications to marry. Tricky to go through, but particularly if you've got someone who came free, they can actually give you the name of the ship that the free person came on. Not in our example, of course, so he just says came free, but sometimes you will see came free and the name of the ship, and sometimes it's helpful because it can clarify that someone was born here or born overseas. So Abby's there, 25 on the competitor too. She's bond, he's free, and then the clergyman in this case was John Dunmore Lang of Sydney. We also have convicts applying for marriage bans, and these go from 1828 to 1842. And this is where the clergyman of a particular church had to send through a list of the convicts that had applied to get married to the colonial secretary, and then whether that marriage was allowed or not allowed. And sometimes here you will get correspondence that backs up that particular decision, so as evidence that they may have already been married or that they haven't provided enough evidence to say that they're now single or widowed or whatever. So here we've got Thomas Henry Baker and Lucy Laws, both aged 30, both providing their details of their ship. She's a widow, he's a bachelor. She's a 14-year convict on the Friendship. He came free on the Medway. She's got a ticket of leave, assistant superintendent of Thomas Walker. It's not allowed because she hasn't got proof of the death of her previous husband. Poor Lucy, who did actually have a bit of a checkered marital career. It wasn't the only time she applied to get married, and I don't think it was the only time that it wasn't allowed to go through. Thinking later on, we're looking at desertion of wives and families. The Police Gazette is such a valuable source for people. The Police Gazette is indexed on ancestry from the 1850s, its early days, 1856 up to 1930. And what you'll find here is when they have warrants for people to be arrested, people getting arrested, people going to court, people complaining that they've had a crime committed against them, people going to jail, people getting out of jail. So it gives you a lot of information about those things. So if you're looking for a particular court case, it can help you work out when and where it happened. And for some of those minor offences, it might actually be the only record that you can come across, particularly with the lower courts, like the Court of Petty Sessions, the Water Police Court, the local courts in the early days. Before 1960, the records are very incomplete. And so the only things that you might find might be something mentioned in the Police Gazette. So all of these deserting wives and families, sometimes you'll get a description of the man and his physical description, and you'll get an address of her. So here we've got Charles Mackenzie deserting Henrietta Mackenzie. He's about 24, and she's at 28 Napier Street, Paddington. And here we've got George Parsons, charged for child desertion. He's 23. And the complainant is Sarah Chandler at 5 Glebe Point Road. And so on and so forth as you go through that list there. We've got Isabella Willis, who was deserted by John, and she's at the Benevolent Asylum in Sydney. So it was a hard life out there, I think, at the time. Now, divorce records are very valuable too. They tell us a lot about why marriages went the way they went sometimes. They're very good if you're doing family history. They're wonderful if there's that family legacy of something that's happened, but you don't know what the story was. They can sort of help you to put everything into place and perspective and all of that. We have divorce files from 1873 to 1976 in that date range. There's some years that we don't have. So we don't have 1968 divorce files. We don't have 1973, 74, 75 divorce files. So divorce was done by the Supreme Court of New South Wales. They could hear causes, they could dissolve marriages, authorise judicial separation, and order the restitution of matrimonial rights. The court could also order payment of maintenance and decide the custody of children and award costs. So they're quite useful to work out what happened to the kids maybe. And then if you're looking for the non-payment of maintenance, police gazettes could be your friend. You can collection search our catalogue for those. So you just need to put in the name of one of the parties, or if it was a common name, maybe put in the wife's name and the husband's name. And you can see those for most of the years that we've got, except 1976. We also have court reporting office transcripts, and these are not complete, so you won't get them for every single divorce, and you won't even get them sometimes for the whole case. It might just be a part of a case. But they can be interesting because they give you what was actually spoken in the divorce. Here we have a photograph of a very young and happy looking Irene Hoskins and William Hoskins in their wedding. And we'll often note in the file title in collection search if there was a photograph for that particular couple. So not always is there a photograph, and often they are folded, as you can see here. This one was folded both directions, but still a find, an absolute find. Looking through the file here, we've got a copy of their certificate of marriage. So that's a very useful thing. You'll usually get that. They got married in 1914. And then in 1939, she files for divorce. So she says she has lived in New South Wales for a long time. She says that there were 2 children who are now 24 and 21, that he deserted her and left her continuously so deserted during 3 years and upwards, and that they haven't colluded together to make this divorce happen. She also here on this page gives a statement of the conditions of her life at the moment. So she says her husband left her 12 years ago. She hasn't received any support from him. She works as a dressmaker to support her 2 children without any outside assistance. So her present income is obtained from the board and lodging paid by her children and also her nephew. And then she has to pay the rent. She has to pay the food. And then she also takes dressmaking from her friends, which gives her about 10 shillings, and she's just able to support herself and supply herself with the bare necessities. So it really gives you a picture of her life, this divorce case file here. She's got no real estate, and the whole of her personal estate, excluding her clothes, is under the sum of £20. Childcare and protection is another area. So yes, girls, children, but also it might reveal a clue about the mothers and why the children are in such a situation. So the Research A to Z, we've got the Childcare and Protection Guide, which details some of the records that we've got. We've got an index to childcare and protection records that covers from the early orphan school records in 1817 right up to the industrial school records and finishes in 1942. We do have records from the Vernon and the Sabran, and so they're boys who were on the industrial school ships, but they may give you information about the mothers and the sisters and things, and the dependent children's registers. So these are useful because they can sort of say why the circumstances of the family. So here we've got the Childcare and Protection Index, Bridget Buckley. We've got 2 applications in applying for Bridget to be pulled out of the orphan school, so both of them looking for her as an apprentice. We've got an application here from William Cox asking for a female orphan to assist Mrs. Cox in nursing the children. So she's quite keen on Susan Anderson or Bridget Buckley, and both of those girls have been recommended to her. And in that same month, Bridget Buckley did actually go to Mrs. Cox to help look after the children. And here we've got a picture of some poor girls later at Randwick Destitute Children's Asylum doing the washing in large concrete tubs. Here we've got the Industrial School for Girls, which was firstly at Newcastle in 1867, and then it's moved several times. So it went to Balaila in 1871 and then to Parramatta. So Parramatta Girls' Home is a more recent name for the Industrial School for Girls. These records are from the 1890s, and they're some very naughty girls who were all, without fail, I think, found to be uncontrollable. Here we've got Ruth or Ruby Hammond, who was found to be an uncontrollable child and had been associating with a low class of young man. A lot of these girls are mid-teens, so they're 14, 15, some are 13 years old, one's 16 there, and it's all that same sort of thing. Education at varying rates, so some quite good, some quite poor, and then details about their parents. So their family circumstances are given, or at least their family names, their mother's names and father's names are given there. So that can help you to identify you've got the right girl. And also, I suppose you can just say that, well, anyone could be an uncontrollable child at 15, I suppose, but we all move through that stage. Here we've got the industrial schools at the Sabran. We've got the Sabran entrance book, and on first glance we've got the beautiful picture of James William Smith down the bottom there. But we also have a lot of detail about how he ended up in the Sabran. We do have information about his mother here. So his mother is given as Mary McGawley, address not known. The lad states that his brother was on the Sabran and 2 sisters in Randwick Asylum. The mother was a bad character and the father is stated to be dead. Boy arrested by police independently. So a bit more about him and how his life was over there. And then he states that his father had left his mother and she was living with another man named J. Macaulay. And we get a physical description of him here. So mum's not around. Mum's living with someone called Macaulay or Macaulay. The sisters are in care. The other brother's in care. So it's not a great picture, but we do hope that James was the better for being in the Sabran, and it helped him to lead a better life later on. We hope. Here we've got the dependent children's registers. So after 1883, they moved really from a system of larger orphanages to this idea of out-of-home care where you'd be in a family environment and children were often boarded out to different households. So here we've got Violet Sims. She's 9 in 1898. 9 and born in 1898. So the admission is 1908. Details of her parents. So her father, Henry, is in Rookwood Asylum. Her mother, Agnes, is at Rydalmere Asylum. So the poor child really did have no parents to look after her. And then here she's fostered out to a variety of people. And then at the age of, in 1913, so she's about 15 years old, she's disposed of to Mrs. Ennis in Devine Street at Erskineville. So at 15, she'd be old enough to work or to be apprenticed out back in at that particular time. We have records of mental health and asylum records. So we've got records from state-run mental facilities, including Gladesville, Callan Park, Kenmore, Rydalmere, Newcastle and Darlinghurst reception houses. We do have some records from the government asylums for the infirm and destitute, so for the women, Newington and Stockton. And later on, Lidcombe Asylum also had women admitted by the 1960s. So patient records are closed for 110 years, with the exception of Liverpool State Hospital and Home, where the records are closed for 30 years. One case study that we've got, for example, is of this Martha Elizabeth Rumpf, who was tried for murder and the murder of her daughters, Elizabeth and Wilhelmina. And this is in 1871. She was acquitted on the ground of insanity, and she was sent to Parramatta Mental Hospital. So the term to be imprisoned during Her Majesty's pleasure was used to describe detention in prison for an indefinite length of time until it was decided it was officially safe to release the offender. It's a common sentence for serious offences or where the plea of insanity was successful. So Martha went to Parramatta Mental Hospital. She was admitted as criminally insane, and then what happened often was that you'd be released from the criminal area to the free area. This is her medical case book, and we get a bit of background as to what's happened. And then as time marches on, we see that it's more of a record of her treatment and her observations of her conditions and things. So she's admitted in 1871 and then discharged in 1874. That wasn't the end of Martha though. So she did get to go back home, but then by the 1890s, she was showing signs of insanity again. So she was returned to hospital. They'd had some difficult times, we understand. They'd had issues where one child had drowned and then she tried to attack another child who was fully grown now. And so it was decided that she needed to go back to hospital. And you find a lot of this correspondence that you see now in the Colonial Secretary's correspondence. So where, someone might have been to a mental hospital, but you're not sure what it was, in the 19th century, the Colonial Secretary's papers can be quite a useful tool to try and just track that down or track down the date of when it actually took place. Court and jail records are useful as well because they can show you where and when someone was tried and their offence. We do have a range of indexes under courts and jails. So we've got our jail photographs index, and we also have some indexes under C for courts as well. In terms of the papers, Supreme Court criminal records have survived fairly completely, but not fully, but they're closed to public access for 75 years. Quarter sessions, which is kind of like the district court these days. We've got a few case papers between 1841 and 1920, like about 2 or 3 boxes. So you're better off to look in newspapers of the day in trove for details of any cases at that time period. And then after 1920, we hold papers again, but they're closed to public access after 1955. We do have some records of some courts of petty sessions or the benches of magistrates or the water police courts. They're arranged by locality, so Bathurst Court of Petty Sessions, Bathurst Local Court, but the problem with those is that they're very incomplete prior to the 1960s. So for some courts there's absolutely nothing, for some courts there's a little bit here and a little bit there. And don't forget newspapers, of course. So the National Library of Australia's Trove website is wonderful for searching newspapers, and you might actually find there's a write-up of the court case, which is a lot more detailed than the record you might find in our collection. Here we have Margaret Greenwood. Now, she had a very sad story. So we've got a photograph of Margaret from 1875. We've indexed and digitised these photographs, and you can find them in collection search from the early 1870s up until 1930. We have done a mini webinar on the jail photographs, and that you'll find in our webinar library. So I won't say a lot more about those here, other than you can see the history of when and where she was arrested, what she was arrested for, and her sentence. So arsony, yes, stealing, yes, but there's a lot of drunkenness, obscene language, stealing, and those sorts of things. And a lot of women do end up in this position where it's these fairly petty crimes, but they're in and out of jail a lot. It becomes a bit of a habitual thing, and it's driven, I suspect, by their circumstances at the time. So Margaret was originally transported as Margaret Shanahan in 1833 under a sentence of house robbery. She was assigned as a domestic servant. She had a daughter in 1837 and then married William Greenwood, who was the child's father. And he was a greatly respected citizen in Araluen. But by the 1870s, her life was falling apart. The husband had died. She was abandoned by her children and became a derelict and embarked on a life of petty crime. And she was killed, as we can see in the record here, in 1887 by a tram. Very sad. And finally, of course, following life through, we've got our deceased estate files, our probate packets, and our intestate estate packets. So the deceased estates are to do with the government working out the value of someone's property at the time of their death, so how much they owned in a dollars or a money term to work out the amount of death duties that would be payable on that estate. So it listed everything the person owned at the time of their death to work out how much death duty should be paid out of that estate before it was passed on to the heirs. Probate packets, we hold those too. They were created by the Supreme Court of New South Wales, and that was more about confirming that the correct heirs received the estates. So that's the process of probate. The will is valid. The executor is the legal person allowed to execute that will, and that everything proceeds properly. And the curator of intestate estates looked after those tricky intestate estates where there was no will, but then they had to try and search for the heirs to the estate. So here we have a will from Elizabeth Throsby. So we've got the will over this side, and here we have a codicil to her will. We've got her lovely signature there down the bottom and over here. Oh, mouse. Here we have a later probate packet. So this one is for a John McHugh. But the interesting thing about this is this document here, which gives the details of the widow. It's really talking about the process of proceeding through the administration process in the usual way, because he died without a will. And then over here we've got signatures of all the children. So if you were having issues trying to track down some of the children of this man, and the daughters who married and obviously have different surnames, this would be one useful way to do that. And then we've got signatures of Catherine, Annie, Mary, and Ursula, and all of their married surnames there. So that could be quite helpful. And finally, we have our Register of Bubonic Plague. So here on this page, I was particularly interested in Ada Lee, who died at the Criterion Hotel. She had contracted plague at the Criterion Theatre, and she died in 1902. She was an actress, not the only one. There was another one as well, Sally Booth, who was 64. Similar circumstances, and she passed away a few days before Ada Lee. Now, Ada Lee had died intestate, and we have her intestate estate case papers. So we have on the right-hand side there the certificate showing that she had died, the date of death, where she had died at the Coast Hospital, and then she's got the full description there, where she's come from, and then on the left there's a letter that was sent to her from her sister to apply for administration of her estate. That was sent from her sister to, or the sister's representation to the curator of intestate estates. Here we just have an inventory of her property, which was taken by the police in March 1902. So we've got over there her trunk, her basket, which contains blouses and skirts and petticoats, wrappers and ulsters and a cape and 2 aprons. She's got a basket trunk, which has got 4 wigs in it. So you imagine this is her clothes as well as her costumes and things too. And then a small basket trunk with caps and hats and various things, gloves, 16 pairs of gloves, 2 pairs of slippers. She's got photos, a clock, mirror. She's got some silk, skirts, dresses, blouses, umbrellas, more hats, a pair of paste diamond earrings. She's got letters and so on and so forth. So it's got all of her belongings there. And then finally for Ada, we have a photograph. We're so lucky to have this photograph because she was an actress on the stage. And she worked with her sister Jenny Lee. And if you research her in Trove, you can actually see mention of her in the newspapers at the time. And there is also a little biography of her online as well. All right, so that is the end of our webinar for today.